Well, howdy y'all, and welcome back to Country Fried Minis. I'm your host Cameron, the country boy in the big city, presenting once more from the Bullshit Corner 2.0, and today I'd like to talk to y'all about incorporating named characters into your forces. Though we're skipping over the model prep steps here, we're going to begin our painting process with a nice even coat of our favorite Stynylrez white primer. Applied in a few light passes until total coverage is achieved, this stark white canvas will work exquisitely for both the light colors of my candy core paint job as well as the proper tone over which we can put contrast colors, which will factor in later on. Once we've got her satisfactorily coated in that preliminary primer, we can move on to applying base coats, which we're going to get into right after mounting our model onto this fabulous first generation Citadel painting handle and preparing our wet palette. The first shade on our agenda tonight is going to be Apple Barrel Turquoise. Though it's an extremely inexpensive craft grade paint, the coverage is fantastic and it performs exceptionally well with a bit of proper thinning. This color generally serves as the fatigues for my personal collection and will be the strongest tie-in to my forces despite Oktavia Grímsdóttir being a named character deserving of a unique paint job. And speaking of painting up named characters, today's feature will touch on that subject just a bit. How to paint up a unique personality while still keeping them in a uniform aesthetic with the rest of your army. Next up, it's time to get out our Balor Brown. Here I've elected to go with the Citadel Air color, as I really like the consistency right out of the pot. It's more or less pre-thinned so as to be shot out of an airbrush, and that tends to work without needing any extra thinning beyond the moisture wicking through the parchment paper on my wet palette. This tannish brownish color will be used on all kinds of accessories, straps, pouches, and holsters alike. Though variation on all these items would be a bit more realistic, it's great to simplify the palette and utilize the single brown across all vaguely similar materials. Now that we've got a solid showing of two thin coats across all the accessories, let's move on to the secondary color for my candy core, which is none other than Plaid's Apple Barrel Bright Magenta. The coverage isn't quite as good as the turquoise, but it's still nice and smooth with a bit of thinning, whether you prefer water or acrylic medium, or even both. This color is the second main shade that makes up the uniforms of my personal collection, but here we're going to use it quite sparingly. Not only is this tone usually reserved for the hardest armor plates on my models, but we're also intent to make Oktavia shine in her own colors as much as in the candy core regalia. For that, the magenta will be present on just a few key places, namely the knee pads, her gloves, and the hard case backpack. By keeping this color reserved, it'll be part of the color scheme rather than dominating it. And with that, it's time to start applying secondary colors, starting with my favorite Golden Fluid Acrylics Carbon Black inside the barrel of her missile launcher, and blacking out the space that rests behind her goggles. This is a bit of a disappointing detail that's unrealistic, but it exists due to limitations of model design when it comes to cast miniatures. Though a harsh undercut would look way more realistic, it would add unnecessary complexity to the design itself, the casting process, and assembly alike. Unusually, choosing to leave this portion of the model a featureless plane is a capitalistic decision that I agree with and stand behind. Anyhow, and digressing, we'll continue slapping on our secondary tones in various places on the model. Mechanicus Standard Gray will cover multiple details, including the boots, her pistol, the goggles, and all the buckles. Just like with the Balor Brown, rendering all these disparate parts in a unified color really helps to simplify our overall palette, making it far easier on the eyes and helping to visually identify various stuffs at a glance. Next up, the foundational tone of Octavia's skin will be Vallejo Pale Skin, applied with precision utilizing a very sharp 5-0 brush. Two thin coats will do the trick and keep this color from getting too chalky, which is a real danger since this paint contains a fair amount of titanium dioxide white pigment. This molecule is notorious for seriously pumping up the particle size in your pigments and leading to really chunky white application. A reason I've quoted many times over in my never-ending praise for Liquitex white ink. From here, we'll go over her weapons with my favorite metallic tone, Vallejo Airbrush Colors Metal Color Jet Exhaust. As always, this stuff goes on so damn smooth in just a single coat. However, it is worth mentioning once again that this paint is purely intended for airbrush use and separates extremely quickly on your palette. Though it actually works just fine when applied by a brush, you'll need to stir it up between just about every dip into your palette. This sounds really inconvenient, but the smooth one-coat application more than makes up for any extra effort that you'll put out. Finally, we're going to apply the first of our colors that clashes with the Candy Corps standards and starts to make this character stand out as herself rather than another grunt in the regiment. By utilizing this shockingly vibrant Fire Dragon Bright to color the handle on her axe, we've put a simple pop of color that begins to identify her as a cold weather soldier. This tiny little touch is enough to start asserting the intended aesthetics of Oktavia herself, despite all the colors so far being those of the Candy Corps regalia. That said, this is just a start to our accenting of this heroine's Antarctic aesthetic. Now that we've got the colors of the Candy Corps on this model, let's dip over to Candy herself and talk a bit about today's character. Good evening, New Hypatia. I'm Candy Double, and you're watching This Just In. Though many of you are still so gripped by the disastrous fighting by factions over on Concilium Prima, our top story tonight comes to you in the wake of the attempted rise of the rogue AI Brutus right here in New Hypatia. Recount that tale of our race for the scoop versus none other than DDC's Abigail Trinity in the description down below. That said, tonight's story speaks to a grave danger facing the coastal citizens of our great city. Following reports of Eugene Imperial Secret Service during inspection unit presence on lands owned by the New Hypatian Port Authority, eyewitness accounts report a grave wildlife threat to the civilian populace. Rumors abound that the Ariadne cuckoo virus has affected local pinniped populations and led to the rise of a mutation in the form of a giant creature dubbed only as the Walrus-Pode. Despite the best efforts of the DIU to suppress news of this grave threat, This Just In has managed to obtain several eyewitness interviews with civilians who have managed to see the beast and survive to tell the tale.
Yeah, well, first I thought it was a submarine, but it got out of the water and it had these cute little beady eyes. But fangs like tree trunks, and flippers like windmills, and it crashed all the containers, and it ate all the durians. I wasn't scared, no, don't scare that easily. It was kinda cute. Do you hear that? Run!
Yeah, so I was down at the dock earlier, and I got this guy who sells me mysterious fruits and vegetables that may or may not have fallen off of a shipping container. Doesn't matter where they came from. Gives me a really good deal. And out of nowhere, boom, huge giant walrus pops up out of nowhere, starts slamming containers down right on top of people, gobbling them up left and right, gobble, gobble, gobble. And out of nowhere, these durians start falling out of this shipping container, and this walrus is just eating every single bit of them. So I take off running. I grab my vegetables, I'm running, and I trip and I fall. But luckily I was still able to salvage a yam and a Hypatian squash, but I don't know what I'm gonna do with them. You can't really make a whole meal with just these two pathetic little vegetables. Well, I guess I could stir fry them or do something like that, but it was crazy. My guy, he was eating. Where am I gonna get my vegetables now? I ain't paying full price. That's why I go down to the dock every day.
Hi, my name's Dan. A few work colleagues of mine suggested that I take a holiday. I think I was getting on their nerves. So they suggested I go to a place called Hypatia, or Hypatia. I don't know how it's pronounced. All I know is that it's got a lovely dock, and it's full of shipping containers, which is, right up my alley. It's exactly what I want from a holiday. I like to travel alone. Everybody else likes me to travel alone. And so I went to the dock, looked into the water, contemplated my life, and this ruddy, giant, what I can only describe as an elephant with flippers, arrived. that started eating everything. It was bloody huge, I tell you. You should have seen it. It crushed a Volkswagen. And that was just its dick.
Taking command of the DIU forces in the area, Xian Yufei has published this statement.
We have received 2 confirmed sightings of this extraordinary walrus, feasting on cargo and corpses discarded from the agile chipmunk. Identifying marks strongly suggest that we are dealing with a single individual, most likely the first Hypatian Walrus-Pode. However, the extent of the antipode cucuvirus's crossover into the local Hypatian walrus population remains uncertain. It is of utmost importance that we prevent this infection from spreading in the wild. To achieve this, I authorize the deputization of beast hunters and bounty hunters, granting them temporary status as full-sanction walrus hunters. All expenses incurred will be fully reimbursed by the Imperial Secret Service. Our mission is to track down and neutralize this Walrus-Pode.
Under his advisement, the DIU has put out calls for authorized walrus hunters, which has attracted mercenaries from all corners of the human sphere. This-just-in field reporters indicate that this call to mercenaries has attracted none other than the legendary harpooner herself, Oktavia Grímsdóttir.
Rostungur rostungur þótt hann sé fín söðull. Ég skal sýna þér í 2 heimana. Frásögn rostungs önnur en rostunga veiðimanna.
Okie day. Now that we've got the base coats applied to our candy core colors, we're going to step in with the next step that is the normal step for getting through the steps of this step-by-step process that goes into painting up my personal forces. Steps. To start us off here, I'm going to slather her down with a heapin' helpin' of Nuln Oil, not worrying about pooling or over-application of this here magic wash. Since the next step after this is going to be re-establishing base tones, we kind of want the excessively heavy black wash to establish our deepest recess shading. In cutting the right corners here, this deepest of dark oily washes will help to cover any crimes of poor application of the base tones, adding in illusory shadows in all the crevices. While we're on the topic of ink washes, we're going to get out our Vallejo flesh wash and put down a little life into her super pale face. This color is great because it'll shade the recesses well, but also enrouge the near white base color we've chosen for her flesh. Though Octavia's got that Icelandic tan, we still want a bit of color in her face, perhaps even a frost-nipped nose and cheeks, as is appropriate for our Antarctic warrior. Building off of her region specificity, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the little touches that make named characters stand out from the riffraff that make up your personal forces. In the case of Oktavia here, she's got some serious cold weather gear which contributes to her personal aesthetic. This includes some easily identifiable accessories such as her fur-lined boots, some ski goggles, and that high visibility jacket. Considering that we want her to be immediately visually identifiable as Oktavia more so than a mercenary for the Candy Corps, it'll do well to put some serious emphasis on the bits that develop her fashion. Though we've included some of the colors of the army at large, the broadest areas of color will be her own styling. This is a fantastic strategy that I highly recommend employing in your own skirmish forces. By giving some thought to emphasizing characterful bits, we can make our characters adhere to lore standards while still blending in with your curated color scheme. A bit of both goes a long way to not only making the unique inclusions stand out, but also has them tie in really well with your collection. These characters deserve a bit of lore adhesion despite their being included in a themed warband. Tangentially, I'd like to heap some praise upon Citadel's Imperial Fist contrast paint. This color covers so very spectacularly over a white base coat using a brush, as well as nearly any color when shot out of an airbrush. I've used both techniques with increasing regularity, and this color is yet to disappoint. Big recommend adding this color to your collection the next time you're in your FLGS and need to toss some $10 to allay your fear at being harshly judged for once again having stepped in for yet another game night without spending any dough, choosing instead to toss copious amounts of disposable income towards big business and Jeff Bezos rather than supporting local business, finding yourself unable to resist the siren call of great prices and free shipping as provided by corporate internet storefront giants, remaining blissfully and willingly ignorant of the direct contribution to the monopolization of hobby supply logistics that you're causing in order to save a couple bucks over the mom and pop markup that your local shop has been forced to implement by the very decision you've just made, further pushing the hyper consolidation of retail end user channels and slowly choking out meaningful competition. Damn it! Just give your FLGS the extra 15%, you jerk. Else we'll gain speed rolling downhill along the deterministic market gradient to dystopian doom. And where in that world is there room for your silly little miniatures game? And speaking of giving money to creators whom you care about, let's take a moment to cool off from that rant, let this paint cure up, and give some thanks to the supporters of this channel. Now y'all surely know that I couldn't do any of this without the generous dedication of those country fried biscuits over on Patreon. Starting this thing off right, I gotta give a piping hot shout out to the artery clogging goodness of our biscuits and gravy tier, whose donations go above and beyond. Spearheading this category is none other than Ronald Catoni. Your contribution to the channel directly offsets operating expenses and warms my cockles like only scalding hot smothered buttermilk biscuits and financial support can do. Big thanks to the big spender, showing your belief in the channel with the hot gravy flowing forth from your wallet. Nextly, I'd be remiss to not take the time to mention that heartiest of classic combo biscuit tiers, our bacon, egg, and cheese biscuits. Iron Elemental, Nathan Johnson, Pete Setchell, and Seismic. The contributions of these folks go directly back into supporting the channel's productions. Be it new models, hobby supplies, or equipment upgrades, the community support makes everything that's going on here possible. Thank all of y'all biscuits immensely for the belief in this silly little channel. Your funding serves up the warm breakfast of making things better, and that's just incredible. And if you'd like to join these folks and get unwrapped in a steamy reveal here on Country Fried Minis, consider showing your support for the channel over on Patreon. Alrighty then, now that we've applied all the original colors as well as some heavy-duty ink washing, it's time to re-establish our base colors once more. Though it's recommended to not allow your Nuln Oil to pool up or get too heavy, I tend to favor using this effect to develop some really deep illusory shadows. For that, it falls on my process to cover up a significant portion of the heavy-handed ink washing, painting once more the original tone over areas that already have color. Though it would sound like this is inconvenient, in doing this extra bit of work I can actually utilize the same color twice as distinct layers that enrich the dimensionality of the model. I've found that going through this process works just fine and dandy, contributing to a solid above tabletop standard for my forces. They aren't the prettiest models in the game store, but they're far from the ugliest. Now that we've got that base color rebuilt over the shadows, the next step up is to move on to the highlighting layers. As always, I'm gonna get out my favorite intensely pigmented color and fluid, which happens to be this fantastic Liquitex white acrylic ink. The beauty of adding this particular agent into your shades to lighten them up is that it's not only richly intense but pretty dang thin, so you don't have to go to the trouble of adding more water to your already thin paint, helping to avoid breaking the emulsion of your acrylic medium and pigments. Further, it's worth tripling down for yet another element of praise for this product in that the pigment's grain is fine enough to avoid the chalking effect that accompanies shades heavily laden with titanium dioxide as their colorant. Though this is an acrylic ink, it has a very satisfying opaqueness to it due to the intense concentration of extremely fine pigment, avoiding the chalking that plagues the efforts of painters of all skill levels in working with white paints from manufacturers both cheap and expensive. Expounding on this topic some more, because it's a pure white ink, this lightening agent is fairly omnipresent in my paint jobs. It's great at brightening up just about any color without shifting the hue too much. Here we're using the same steps and the same ink to re-establish the Baylor Brown and then highlight it up. Digressing, it's at this point in the process that I want to talk to y'all about one of my favorite tricks in the box that constitutes this country fried painting repertoire, and that's Mr. James Workshop's Citadel brand contrast medium. This here slick gossamer fluid can transform any of your chosen acrylic paints into a magic goopy stain that works just like any other contrast tone. Just a couple drops of our acrylic with a hearty squirt of our white liquid into it will mix up and make a proper one-coat magic speed paint. Here we're choosing to using the same apple barrel turquoise paint to make a cold color to serve as both shade and shadow for Octavia's shockingly pale hair all in one coat. Whenever I'm working with organic bits that need to be white, such as platinum hair or wings, I opt for a nice pale blue or bluish color to impart a properly cold tone to the work. To further emphasize that cold feel, we'll also use that same contrast color to put a wash along the lower half of her weapon, serving as some subtle blue light reflected onto the metallic surface. Here in the case of both Octavia's hair and her missile launcher, we'll emphasize both her Icelandic heritage and the frozen surroundings with our cooling color, leaving her looking
to perfection.
Damn, I love that movie. Anyhow, now that we're back to just more of the same highlighting method as before, just utilizing the bright magenta instead of the turquoise, I want to run a sidebar of conversation here and present my thesis once again in an earnest attempt to suggest a great method to y'all for incorporating named characters into your army list. Though it's simple to lean on painting them in the exact same method as the rest of your forces, and that approach would be completely valid, I'd like y'all to consider the impact of splitting the color scheme half and half between your own palette and the proper box art for characters. In utilizing this method wherein you find a way to add in your colors here and there, you remain true to the lore of your in-game universe, tying this individual to both the fluff as well as your own forces. The next time you're considering adding a personality replete with special rules to your band of skirmishers, give a nod over to the developers and their flavorful, unique individuals that have a home broader than a mere tabletop effect, accentuating your playstyle. Plus, it's fairly simple to do this, as shown by the choices I've made in this project. I hope that this example of painting up Octavia's cold weather gear in the proper high visibility colors while also retaining the typical jumpsuit colors of light infantry within the Candy Corps fatigue standard shows that finding the middle ground between these two schemes is pretty straightforward. I'm sure that with the barest modicum of calculation in your application of coloration, your own paint up of characters will easily find that middle ground which straddles the line between your own interpretation and canonicity, coming together to enhance your personal immersion in whatever game's universe your models exist in. Digressing from that long-winded lungful, we're going to hit the face with some highlights and paint up the eyes, on film this time. My method involves first taking some white paint on the tip of a sharp brush and giving a little tappy-do to the eyes themselves. We're going to do what we can to be precise about this application, but it's okay if you paint outside the lines, as we'll clean it up later. Next, get out your best black paint. In my case, it's going to be my favorite Golden Fluid Acrylics Carbon Black. Ensure that the paint is thin enough to flow smoothly off the tip of your brush and carefully apply it in the center of the now white scleras of our heroine's eyes. Again, it's okay if we go outside the lines a bit, as the next step here is to get back out the highlight tone for the skin and carefully correct the overspill on our eyelids. If anything, this is probably the point at which we need to be the most careful and clean up those edges with precision. All in all, this series of steps is intense and nerve-wracking, but if we take some time and take a breath and remember to be happy when we're painting, it'll go smoothly and with a great effect. Finally, we've got just a few more spots to finish up, and this here mercenary will be ready for basing. Since we've already got some white ink on our palette, we'll take a bit and mix it up with that go-to medium color, Mechanica Standard Gray. After re-establishing the base shade on this color, we'll mix in our white carefully and touch the tips with care to establish that same standard of highlighting that we've used on the model so far. The simple formula here is going to be as follows: base coat, ink wash, re-establish base tone, highlight 1, and highlight 2. In 5 simple layers, you too can have your models looking pretty damn spiffy with satisfying dimensionality without spending ages on individual pieces. I'd estimate that each standard-sized infantry model will take about 4 hours using this method. It's not as fast as speed painting, but nowhere near as the intense time sink of painting up a display piece. Anywho, the last color on our highlighting quest is going to be a bit of Vallejo metal-colored duraluminum. We'll do the same here, but perhaps be a bit more reserved, favoring the upper edges which would be more directly exposed to sunlight. Honestly, most of the highlighting through this project has been done in kind of the same fashion, with a special emphasis given over to edges and faces which would receive the most direct light. And lastly, we'll dot the opening of our missile launcher's tube with black and move on to the basing of the model. Funny how a carefully shaped splotch of inky blackness here will really emphasize the weapon's tubular nature and provide a bit of believability to the model. Now here at the basing bit, I'm just going to go over the steps real quick like, as I don't necessarily suggest subjecting yourself to this extra work. I'll go around the base with the two main colors of the candy core, our bright magenta making up the front art and the turquoise constituting the back facing. From here, it's a simple all-over coat of Citadel's Astrogranite as an easy pavement texture. I want to emulate the aged surface of a country highway, and this stuff does a great job. Next up, I'll get out my white ink and trace the swirly pattern that's iconic to my Infinity models. Usually 3 passes gets the opacity just right. Using the same white, I'll build up some lines on our road surface, and then we can let it dry before finalizing the final steps of the paint up. Wrapping this thing up is going to require just 2 last tiny touches. First of those, I'm going to add some visual interest on the base with this here little Paradiso flyer printed out on my home printer. I'll carefully cut it as close to the art as I can with my art shiv, and then use the same tool to rough up the edges real good. From there, I'm going to get out a guest palette, which today is a self-branded sticker, and pour out a tiny little puddle of PVA glue onto it. No need for some fancy hobby brand, Elmer's Glue All is more than sufficient for our application. Utilizing a pair of super sharp tweezers, we'll dip the back of our tiny little flyer into the glue, remove any excess with a quick swipe, and then carefully lower it into place. To reinforce this applique, we'll get out a small ratty old brush and smear a bit of PVA glue onto the surface of the paper. This will cause our happy little detail to dry up rock hard as the sticky white glue cures into a solid yet rubbery synthetic polymer. Evidently this here polyvinyl ester is also a type of thermoplastic. Imagine that! Continuing with the trend of utilizing sticky translucent fluids in the hobby process, it's time to bust out the airbrush and my go-to Winsor & Newton brand Artist Acrylic Matte UV Varnish and hit this model with several light coats until we've achieved full coverage. This stuff is incredible. Its finish is flat as heck, it don't yellow, and has a tactile feel to it so you really get a sense that your models are adequately protected for handling. Anyhow, with that done, it's time for a grand reveal. Now wasn't that a fun paint up? I really think so. I had a blast doing it. I think that the techniques presented today go a long way in blending your models in both the fluff and your army. I think hitting that 50-50 point is a really swell way to do it, and it's crazy how such a tiny model can have such a big impact on your army. Anyhow, I want to thank y'all for joining me here today in the Bullshit Corner 2.0 here on Country Fried Minis. If you like what you see here, go ahead and toss a like down below and maybe drop us a comment if you have any questions, comments, or input. If you really want to show support for the channel, why not consider becoming a channel member? For as little as $1 a month, you can have access to a fun little badge next to your name, biscuit-based emojis, ad-free videos, and priority consideration for subscriber streaming events. Digressing off of that solicitation, I really do want to thank y'all for joining me today. Of course, I want you to remember to be happy while you're painting, and to remember that your participation in these here videos and streams and all this fun stuff makes me happy while I'm painting. In any case, I've been Cameron on behalf of Country Fried Minis. Y'all take it easy now. See you around next time. I just want to point out that it's the dead center of December. It's 80 degrees in my apartment. The windows are closed. I got a jacket on. I can't even have the fan on. The things I do for y'all, why don't you like the video? Just give it a little tappy tap, 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 right down below.